like we've got a decent amount of people logged on. So my name is Matt Holland. I'm the program and volunteer coordinator at the Buffalo History Museum. Welcome to one of our webinars. Tonight's webinar is, it didn't happen overnight, the Tulsa Race Massacre with Dr. Peggy Brooks-Bertram. Just a little bit of ground rules before we start. We do record everything. So if anybody's having issues with audio, or you know somebody that wanted to watch it but couldn't, I send out a link from our YouTube page after we post it, so that everybody can watch the video later on. And so you can look to our YouTube page as well if you know somebody that wants to watch the webinar later on. And we will have a Q&A in the end. Please use the Q&A function. You can use the chat, but it's just easier if you just use the Q&A function, because it can get kind of confusing as questions start scrolling up and it's hard to keep track of them. So, so first I would like to introduce you to Dr. Peggy Brooks-Bertram, who is co-founder and president of the Uncrowned Queens Institute for Research and Education on Women's Inc. The creation of the Institute was 2 decades ago as part of Buffalo Salute to the 1901 Pan American Exposition, and has led to the largest and oldest digital repository. She is co-author of the groundbreaking book written for the first African-American First Lady in the United States, Michelle Obama. Recently, she compiled and edited letters from women representing 5 continents and 11 countries, resulting in the publication of the first book of letters to the first African-American Asian Vice President of the United States, titled Dear Kamala, Women Write the New Vice President. And she's also the biographer for Drusilla Dunjee-Houston, and her research on Houston has spanned 2 decades. So Dr. Bertram, would you like to begin?
Yes, I'd like to begin by telling the viewers that I've written a letter to you because I believe in letters. So in January of 2021, I compiled and edited and published a book of letters with Indiana University Press called Dear Kamala, Women Write to the New Vice President. I always believed in the power of letters, so I thought I would write a personal letter to you as tonight's visitors, hoping that it would help to steady my nerves and strengthen my resolve to tell this history as it was. I contributed a letter to the book, and in that letter, I talked of a poem my mother often repeated to us. It goes like this. When you pass by a board with upturned nails and a broken bottle or two, do you pause for a moment to make it safe for the one who comes after you? Life would be beautiful, only if we would make it safe for others too. For the one you love might be the one who comes after you. The Tulsa Race Massacre continues to be one of those boards with upturned nails. As a society, we must begin to recognize, properly historicize, and remove those nails and broken bottles that threaten our very lives on this planet. What I want to do is to present candidly what I uncovered over years of researching, and I hope to do that in 30 or 40 minutes or more and leave time for questions. You will find that I'm a lover of the fine little details of history, my role in doing that, and I want to present those facts to you. I hope you forgive me for some coarse language, which I'm given to resort to when I get excited. And I want to say that I don't have to be perfect in my presentation, because CNN, Oprah Winfrey Network, the Smithsonian Institute, Atlantic Magazine, National Geographic, and other sophisticated, well-funded programs by rich Black and white people out of Tulsa and around the nation, they weren't perfect in their presentations either. So I will introduce a few new data, a little new data, and I will present what I know from years of research on this and related subjects. So let the show begin. There's been a lot of discussion about whether this was a riot or a massacre. So I want to clear that up by saying, let's define what a riot is. Some argue that people during that period used the word riot to describe any large conflicts between whites and other groups. But a massacre describes killing of a large number of people indiscriminately. And it may also suggest that African Americans offered no resistance. That's inaccurate. So I wanted to introduce you to a person that I met, a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Her name was Olivia Hooker. She died 2 years ago, I believe, at 103. She couldn't wait any longer for the state of Oklahoma to make reparations for the loss of her family, the loss of their home, and everything else. She was a little girl when that happened. And you see here a picture of her when she was just about 103. I knew this woman. I'm here again in Oklahoma with Olivia Hooker and 2 other survivors. And on the right side, close to 50 survivors at the time when my colleague and I went to Oklahoma. But there were a number of events before the massacre. The Red Menace, as people call it, around the country, where it's lynching, property destruction, and other kinds of attacks on Blacks. And then there was World War I, Black troops returning to fight frightened whites, planning to keep Black soldiers in their place. And that whole story, especially the Houston riot of 1917, where Blacks were coming back from World War I, and whites attacked them and demanding that they give up their rifles and so forth. And there were other events in Oklahoma that took place before the massacre. It was the growth of the all-Black towns, and there were calls for a Black state. This worked on the nerves of Blacks in Oklahoma, whites in Oklahoma. Black people were establishing schools and training teachers for Black children. White people were not doing that. There was the Black Baptist Convention that gained more territory and parishioners, and which was looking very, very healthy in terms of finances, in terms of parishioners, and also in terms of buildings. And then there was the horrible Kellyville train disaster of 1917, where the Oklahoma created the NAACP. And the Kellyville train disaster was pivotal here because it pointed to the modes of transportation that Black people had to use in order to get across the state. For example, Black men and women and children were forced to sit in the wooden train cars that were directly behind the coal-fired furnaces. And whenever there was any kind of problem, coals from the furnace would fall onto the wooden cars that Blacks traveled in and create a fire. And that's what happened in this instance. And in this instance, hundreds of, not necessarily hundreds, but scores of Black students coming home from college were killed. Other events is that Black women were fighting back, forming their clubs and operations and church organizations in order to make a stand about how they were treated in Oklahoma. The Black towns in Oklahoma, 13 of them at the time, were prospering, and whites didn't like that. They were doing very well on their own. There was a court case that was brought also very early on in Oklahoma educational history. And that court case got equal pay for Black teachers. White people did not like that. And finally, the Black newspapers were truly prospering, and they were being read not just in their areas, but they were being read all around the country. And some of them were being read in the islands as well. But the big problem with Oklahoma, and there's little talk about it, especially as it relates to the Tulsa Race Massacre, is the fact that the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, ruled Oklahoma throughout the 1920s. And here you see a kind of an edict that they put out warning people of what they could do and what they couldn't do. And it's all couched in religious terminology so that the church, the white church of the white Democrats who had come from the South to Oklahoma, was fully behind the Klan. In fact, what I found most interesting was that there was and there still continues to be, a discussion about the airplanes that were in use that were dropping kerosene balls onto the people of Tulsa and onto their houses. And historians have been very careful about reporting on that and trying to say, no, that really didn't happen, or if it did happen, it was very slight, that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is, through some little complicated research, I was able to find that there was a man named Colonel William Simmons in 1915. He was in Atlanta, Georgia, at the birth of the Second Klan, Stone Mountain, Georgia. And he was a member of the United States Air Service. And he and a whole group of men who were members of that air service left the United States government and became members of the Ku Klux Klan, setting up their own air service. And keep in mind that this group did not want Black people, especially Black men, to learn how to fly. And they may very well, some of them, have been responsible for manning those aircraft, some of them that dropped fire on the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Another direct result of the Tulsa race riot was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And while the Klan had a limited presence in Tulsa before 1921, the Klan leaders used this riot or the massacre, or at least the impression of it, as a springboard as a recruiting tool and moral justification for the Klan itself. One Klan speaker visiting Tulsa from Atlanta in August of 1921 claimed it was the best thing that ever happened to Tulsa, and that by the mid-1920s, the Klan had reached its peak influence with significant numbers of Klansmen embedded in both the city and county government. Blacks were educating themselves. That infuriated whites in Oklahoma. There was, again, the Kellyville train disaster. There were lynchings. The state tried to eliminate drawing from Black schools. And let me tell you why that was important. Because if you didn't know how to draw, you couldn't become a draftsman. You couldn't understand how to build things. You couldn't understand a number of things that required for you to sit down and lay out the plans for construction of something. And so the State Education Board attempted to eliminate drawing from Black schools. And Black women fought that. Edwin McCabe, a homesteader in the early Oklahoma, was calling for an all-Black state to be established. There were other all-Black towns that were flourishing, 13 of them. Tulsa Stroke Oil. There was a fight for parity in the Black teacher salary, with white teacher salaries being higher at the time. And it was Drusilla Dunjee-Houston who raised a court case in her own name and was able to secure equal pay for equal work very early in Oklahoma. And again, whites were very unhappy with this. This again points to the fact that all of this happened before the 1921 disturbance. Black newspapers, and Drusilla Dunjee-Houston actually ran one of those papers, were flourishing, and they had wide distribution throughout, and some of them abroad. Now, again, I want to go back to, and this seems a little off the beaten path, but I want to go back to the fact that white men did not want Black men in the armed services to learn how to fly. And so everything was put into place to make sure they didn't. But Black women early on, especially Bessie, who was that? I guess I should have come back. I'm not sure how to go back now. Bessie Smith learned how to fly. And then later on, we would have an opportunity to meet this woman by the name of Mae Jemison, who was the first Black female astronaut. And my friend Barbara, I know she's in the meeting, she will remember us meeting her. some areas of discussion that you can't overlook when you talk about what happened again in Tulsa was Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And immediately after Uncle Tom's Cabin, white Democrats from the South who had lost land and the war were carefully watching Black men who had land and homes and a desire to have an all-Black state. And there was a discovery of oil in Tulsa. In the early 1900s, Edmund McCabe made efforts to make Oklahoma this all-Black state. Whites didn't like that. In 1901, Reverend Thomas Dixon saw Uncle Tom's Cabin on stage, fell out crying and shouting that he was going to tell the real story of the South. What he meant was he was going to tell the big lie of the South. And he began writing novels that were turned into stage plays. And one of them was The Leopard Spots. The next one was The Klansman. The next one was The Traitor. And then in 1915, working with G.W. Griffith to put together the film, The Birth of a Nation. It was over a century of lynching. And I just show you this so that you could see this country was not very happy with Black people and showed their disgust with us. And you see that almost in all of these areas in the South, most of the South, but again, moving towards the West, Black people being lynched. And then there were the Black massacres, and they referred to it as the Red Minutes. And all over the country, Black people were attacked. Some of them were worse than others, as in East St. Louis, Louis, Missouri, and particularly in Atlanta in 1906 and other areas. And Drusilla Dunjee-Houston, some people had said she was in Tulsa during the time of the riot. And that, in fact, was discussed on Oprah Winfrey. That's not true. She was not in the riot. She was leaving Tulsa because she had a sense that something was going to go down and it didn't feel right. And so she caught the train and left. And then there was the whole question, and I discussed it a little bit, about fire from the skies, where nobody could believe that the Air Force or members of the Air Force who had left the Air Force, that they actually took to the planes and dropped fire on the American people. And there's a report that the Germans were absolutely mortified and said, at least they did not do that to their own people. They couldn't understand it. I discussed what the whites did everything they could to keep Blacks out of airplanes. And they didn't want them to become pilots, didn't want them to learn how to draw, attacked public education, and prevented Black teachers from teaching math, but they taught math nonetheless. And again, constructed the big lie that Blacks did not have the courage, the brains, or the aptitude to fly. And we know that's not true. And again, the formation of the Klan, the Knights of the Air, and they even tried to recruit General Pershing and used his name, saying that he was going to be joining this group of Knights of the Air who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he wrote a rebuttal to that claim. And the guy who led that was a guy named William Joseph Simmons. And he appointed himself the emperor and the imperial wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and began a crusade to increase membership that reached its height in the 1920s. So really, Oklahoma was really a hotbed. And this is this guy, Simmons, with these other air people who were in the air, and they in the air service of the United States government. And they wanted to be known as the Knights of the Air, again, with the Ku Klux Klan attached to their name. The one Black woman that described that airship that was dropping bombs on Tulsa said that as that airship soared over the colored district and threw bombs on Black homes, anger grew hotter and hotter within me. And if I had 7 sons that day, I would have devoted everyone to death. This is Drusilla Dunjee-Houston speaking about how awful it was, and that she would have given up her 7 sons to have been able to have them stand and fight to support Tulsa. Again, Tulsa didn't happen overnight. All of this was percolating and baking in an oven of hatred and violence that white people had against African Americans. Drusilla Dunjee-Houston wrote courageously on the Tulsa Massacre. She made the very early call for reparations, and they still haven't received reparations. She had an incredible courage, and immediately after the massacre, she wrote at least 3 angry columns in the Black Dispatch where she called for reparations while an armed Ku Klux Klan patrolled the streets of Tulsa and continued to murder Black people anywhere in Oklahoma. She was a very courageous woman and was co-editor or co-owner of the Oklahoma Black Dispatch with her brother Roscoe Dungey. This is how her editorial page looked. And she described what she called, in the hour of mob violence, the lesson of Tulsa. And she laid out very poignantly ideas about what she thought that people in Tulsa had done wrong, and that what Black people continue to do wrong. And the first thing she pointed out is, don't show white people how well you are doing. Don't associate with them, and arm yourself. That was something for a Black woman to write on an editorial page of the Black Dispatch a day or so after the riots. She stated that she was in Tulsa 1 hour before the riots began, and she had seen the wicked air in the streets. And the day of the riot, she passed through on her way to Muskogee, and her mind told her to go home early, and she thanks God for taking her out of that district in time. So I'll talk to that. I found this photo of white children outside an African-American residence that they had set on fire in September. White women had joined the Klan. Children were engaged, like you see here, in also wreaking havoc upon African-American people. This is Laura Nelson and her son hanging from the New Canadian Bridge with onlookers, children onlooking. Laura had been raped, although she was pregnant, and she begged, please don't kill my baby. And what we didn't understand is still don't understand why raping Black women before lynching them. And they put in the newspaper after the Laura lynching said she was, and to demean her further, she was very Black, very small of stature, very Black, about 35 years old, and vicious. Mother and son were hauled by wagon 6 miles west of town to a new steel bridge crossing the Canadian River in a Negro settlement where they were gagged with tow sacks and hung from the bridge. After the riots or the massacre, the Negroes of Oklahoma really came together and formed a Citizens Relief Committee, donating all the money that they could. Again, I pointed out that the women of the Ku Klux Klan, they had enrolled over 150,000 new members in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Indiana, and other places. And like the men's organization, theirs reached its peak membership in the Southwest in early 1924, with Oklahoma, the mother state for the concept, having more Klanswomen than any other Southwestern state, and one of the highest numerical strengths of any state in the nation. And as I said, it didn't happen overnight in Tulsa. It was brewing. There was a 1906 Atlanta riot, Springfield, and all these other riots. Clearly, massacres all over. It didn't happen overnight. But Oklahoma was in the belly of the beast. Oklahoma, 1900 to 1921 and beyond. And why? Because of the grandfather clause of 1907, where Blacks were denied in the very first Senate bill of the Oklahoma state legislature, they were denied the opportunity to vote. And then there was the Southern Theater District circuit that ran throughout the South. And that theater circuit presented Thomas Dixon's novels and plays, namely The Klansman, all throughout Oklahoma. And what was so powerful about that, in order to make sure that all the poor whites who were in the outlying areas who could not otherwise see the play, they set up something called a midnight train to Oklahoma City, where they would be brought in and they would be taken to the theater so that they could see the plays and stay overnight. And oftentimes after those plays, they would go out into the street and shoot somebody black. And then there was The Birth of a Nation, that film, and the discovery of oil in Tulsa. And what all of these things indicated is that white people were carefully looking at Black people, looking at everything that they were able to acquire, sniffing around them, always trying to understand what successes they had, what things they thought they shouldn't have, what successes they shouldn't have. Black people in Oklahoma were in the belly of the beast 10 to 12 years before 1921. Then there was the Red Summer. You see all these places where they talk about the murders, the lynchings, the killings of African Americans, and destruction of entire towns. And then 1921 in Oklahoma. But I have to go back to the writings of Thomas Dixon, because Thomas Dixon's novel, The Klansman, was one of the plays that was on the Southern Theater circuit. And it played throughout the South. And extraordinary to it was Thomas Dixon was a very good friend of Woodrow Wilson. They went to Johns Hopkins University together. He went to Woodrow Wilson and said to him, "Will you work with me on turning this Klansman into The Birth of a Nation?" The President of the United States did the following. That when The Klansman was turned into the film, or led to the film, The Birth of a Nation, the President of the United States wrote the intertitles for the scenes in the book, in the screenplay, The Birth of a Nation. Before that, somebody at a high level, can't prove it was the president, allowed Thomas Dixon to use the United States cavalry horses that were stationed at the Fort El Reno in Fort El Reno, Oklahoma. And Thomas Dixon, every time he did a show, he would have those horses at his disposal. They would be draped in white sheets, and white Klansmen dressed in the Ku Klux Klan's outfits would ride those horses thundering down the streets of McAllister, Oklahoma, or any other place in Oklahoma, and trot into the back door of the theaters and rush onto the stage and send the white crowd into a frenzy. So yes, Dixon was in Oklahoma years before The Birth of a Nation. All these years indicate when he starred in his own plays, The Klansman, The Woman, the One Woman. And he personally had the go-ahead and the capability to do all of these things because the entire government in Oklahoma supported him. They tried to get the ministers' union to, the Blacks tried to get the ministers' union to get the mayor to keep Dixon from appearing on the stage, because every time he appeared on the stage, people went crazy and would run into the streets and oftentimes attack a Black person. The years of Oklahoma statehood and Blacks lost the vote. U.S. cavalry horses, farewell performance. This film, this play, the Birth of the Klan, was taken to Europe and Australia. And those horses were shipped abroad, just like they had been shipped abroad for the law, for the war. They were also shipped abroad, making an enormous impact when they rushed onto the stage. Newspaper ads were citing the record-breaking tour of the Klansmen. Again, the cavalry horses were used over and over. The Birth of a Nation tickets were available for mulattoes, but not real Black people, just mulattoes. And they had to sit on the lower floor. And the balconies were draped in American flags. Again, someone higher up gave the authority that the United States government and the cavalry horses could represent a cohesiveness with Thomas Dixon, the KKK, and others who were against Blacks in the country overall. D.W. Griffith went so far as to say that school children should see the film, and that the film should be replacing history books, where you just go into a booth and press a button to watch. You didn't need any teachers, no books needed to educate them, just the film. Blacks were horrified. But Thomas Dixon also wrote another novel called The Sins of the Father. And it appeared, you can see here, all these times in Oklahoma. Again, I called it Oklahoma was in the belly of the beast. And I said that. But Houston, Drusilla Dunjee-Houston, another important person for the who fought against the birth of a nation. She probably saw the first film with the return of Black soldiers from San Juan Hill. That was the amazing 24th Black Infantry. And for those of you who are teachers and have an opportunity to give your class an assignment of finding out who was the amazing 24th Black Infantry, she began writing about Ethiopians, Black people, and the contributions to history. And Thomas Dixon was starring at the Oberhauser Theater in Oklahoma, and she in McAllister, Oklahoma, which is where she lived. In 1908 to 1911, Kenna McCullough, which we very usually do not talk about, there were experiments at the Oberhauser Theater. Free tickets were offered for those who couldn't pay. Houston likely attended. So what she was able to do was to watch film first coming to life, modifications in the film being added color to the films in Oklahoma, and all this work that Thomas Dixon was doing in Oklahoma, and she was essentially surrounded by film. That was not the case with people like Du Bois, Alan Locke, Schomburg, and others. But there she was, a woman in Oklahoma with these experiences. And again, Thomas Dixon lionized in Oklahoma for his stage plays. And he had those well before the birth of a nation. So the film was one thing, but the Southern theater circuit, taking his plays and novels all across the nation, but especially up and down the Southern corridors, was something that kept people riled up against Black people. Again, it happened not overnight. And the government supported his plays. Again, the horses and the Klansmen. But this piece here, if you will take a look at it, I put together this chart. The dates of the stage plays, the newspapers that represented it, the location of Black female lynchings, the theater that it was shown at, the name of the play that he had written, and what happened with Black women after many of those. Laura Nelson, in 1912, murdered, raped, and hung. Laura Nelson's son, the next day, the burning of John Lee. And then there's another woman, Maria Scott, and another man. I don't know why I can't show it here, but those other people. So there was a direct connection in my mind between Thomas Dixon's, especially The Sins of the Father, Thomas Dixon and his starring in these stage plays, and a Black woman being murdered. And again, He's getting ready to go on tour and leaving America and going to Australia and Europe. So one of the things I'm suggesting that people go back and take a look at is the role of film in the events leading up to May 31st, 1921. Launching of the Mississippi Plan. That's a whole body of literature where they were asking, Oklahoma was asking all the states where Blacks migrated and they wanted whites to keep threatening Blacks and for who are trying to uphold their freedoms. Drusilla Dunjee-Houston responded, but never mentioned her play. She kept this response to Birth of a Nation undercover for 2 decades. It was called Spirit of the South, the Madden Mob. And here in this, in her own handwriting, is a page from the original document that her aunt gave to me more than 10 years ago. And in this document, through this document, Drusilla Dunjee-Houston braves the Wilsonian acts that would threaten people, Black people, who said anything negative about the government. And it was the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. Drusilla Dunjee-Houston quietly violated all of that, talking about white history and dragging that white history, which she saw as a rotting carcass and a stain on humanity, and for their attacks on Black people. It was really quite dangerous what she wrote. And she addressed themes such as the distortion of the history of Reconstruction, the stereotypical portrayal of Negroes, miscegenation, the creation of the tragic mulatto, the invisible nation, the white male rape of Black women, and on and on. This is just to give you some idea of the advertisement for that film, which was in color and really just breathtaking for people who saw it. And this is what I was able to buy an original ticket online so that you could see this is a ticket that was sold. And then there was an advice sheet for the Birth of a Nation. And the primary thing, it says, D.W. Griffith put it together, Birth of a Nation. And the bottom it says, please bear in mind that Negroes must not be admitted to the birth of a nation under any circumstances. They did not want us to see what they were saying about us. Drusilla Dunjee-Houston called for reparations one day after the Tulsa Race Massacre. And she said, if Tulsa does not punish these mob leaders, then we should make her pay for the damage done. They were never addressed nor granted. But I must say that when I was in Oklahoma, I did have a time to talk with people who also came to Buffalo to meet with my colleague and I at the time, Barbara Nevergall, to talk about a committee that had been put together to talk about reparations, but the reparations never came. What's most fascinating, it was one thing to see the riot, the massacre in 1921. A full year later, in 1922, there was an article in the Black Dispatch saying something absolutely horrific. And they had a picture of a family of 10 or 12 Black people in an old car. And it says, Negroes on a Southern plantation hadn't heard of freedom. They had been kept under lock and key and refused to leave where they were. They were in the Mississippi flood area, and they were prevented from leaving concentration camps without the consent of their landlords, and also attempts to charge them for having one being taken care of. This was extraordinary. In 1922, that a group of family were held hostage. And in other instances, African Americans trying to leave Mississippi were held at gunpoint until they would bring in the last crop, and then they could leave. And they may even have to do that for free. I'm at the end of this. my mind is racing. I want you to know that it didn't happen overnight. Everything was in place. It just didn't happen overnight. The Tulsa riot, race massacre. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Peggy, for that great the great presentation. So do we have any questions? Does anybody want to put anything in the Q&A? Always takes a moment. Everyone's typing. All right, well, doesn't look like we have any questions. Oh, here we go. There, always takes a while for them to come in. Oh, we just have a thank you, Peggy, for your dedication. And thanks for the interesting presentation. Do you have any suggestions for further reading, Dr. Bertram?
Yeah, I think that because, like I said, I'm a lover of the itty bitty little detail, and it's the details of history that lead you to these big pockets of information. And so I would, for example, urge people, because I'm also writing something on the birth of a nation and how Drusilla Dunjee-Houston responded to it with a screenplay that no one else in the world did. It is an extraordinary document. I would urge people to take a look at the silent film era and how that set into place the way Black people would be described to the world. It would be ignorant. It would be lowlife, uneducated, thieves, unable to do certain things, like are never able to be pilots, that if they could look at the finer details that historians either overlook or don't understand. And that is one way that, and you don't have to start big. You can just take a look, a small look at something that you see and you can't believe, like, who flew those planes over Tulsa? When historians said for years, oh no, that never happened. And we find out people who had been trained by the United States government had a role at some level, and we need to know what that role was.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions coming in? All right, I think we're good. Thanks so much, Dr. Brooks-Bertram. That was a very, very interesting presentation. And thanks for coming on and doing that with us.
Thank you for having me. I think it's very important that we get a chance to talk to one another in this way, and to be able to understand some of the intricacies of history, the things that fall through the cracks. And you don't have to look over the whole globe. You can just look in one little space, like Oklahoma. And from my chart, you can see, oh, let me point out too, a person that I worked with talked with me about the grave sites in Oklahoma, the mass graves. For years, the Oklahomans say, no, nothing happened like that. But then I was doing some of this work years ago, and this person said, well, I have a confession to make. My father was at the fairgrounds and helped to cover up the bodies of African Americans who were there. And I said, wow. You know, he said, my father was a criminal and a member of the Klan, but he was there and he shared that with his family.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and so we did just get a question. Just so you know, if later on, if you want to view this webinar. We'll be posting it on the museum's YouTube page. I'll send out a link to everybody who's registered, but if you know somebody who isn't, or whatever, it'll eventually appear on there. It usually takes us about 5 business days to put it up, just so you know. So, yeah.
Okay,
well,
I see Q&A. What does that mean?
Yeah. No, I've been reading those. I just answered the most recent one. We've got a lot of thank yous, and yeah, there's a lot of praise and thank yous in the Q&A. So
And I would like to let people know that one of the things that I've done in looking at this history, and there's so much of it that I couldn't include, that I'm also, the University of Mississippi Press has accepted my book which is a biography of the life of Drusilla Dunjee-Houston. And I'm absolutely thrilled. And it gives me an opportunity to talk about this person in depth and what she did. And also to a second book talking about her response to Thomas Dixon and D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation, and her original document refuting that screenplay. And I think both will be of very much interest to our community.
Yeah. And we did get a new question. How did you start your research? I don't know if it's like more of a how were you interested, or more like how did you just begin researching it question.
Let me tell you, I was not trained as a researcher, but November the 11th, 1988, I was in a church meeting at the St. John Baptist Church here in Buffalo, and a man was giving a presentation called The Stolen Legacy. And people knew I was working with the Buffalo Board of Education, and they kept telling me, you got to go and hear this consultant speak. So I finally broke down and went. And he had a slide presentation showing photographs of all of the ancient African members of civilization, the old Kushite dynasties, which you can find, they're written about in the Bible. But I had never seen anything like that. All these Black faces from the dawn of civilization. And I thought, oh, Jesus, how come I don't know this? And I walked up to the man and said, help me here. I need to know something. And it formed a 20-year friendship with Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III. And that meeting took me around the world almost, looking for the ancient Kushites. And then finally, he said, you need to read a book written by Drusilla Dunjee-Houston. I read that book. It took me a long time to do it. I wrote a second dissertation on that book. I wrote another book regarding that. That's what got me started with the Drusilla Dunjee-Houston. And that took me to Oklahoma. And I went to find the Dunjee family to say, look, do you know this about your great-great-grandfather? And then they started calling me, people started sending me papers, and I have closets of papers. I don't recommend that for anybody. It's really a nightmare. But that's how I got started with this. And then her life for years, I mean, every day I do something related to Drusilla Dunjee-Houston, and I find different things. And that's how that happened. But it was here in Buffalo that I ran into Drusilla Dunjee-Houston.
Yeah. So it looks like we're out of questions, and well, so big thank you to you, Dr. Brooks-Bertram, for
just a second, Matt. I hear somebody
yeah.
Sandy White asked me something.
Yes, I see that. No, that I did not catch that.
And could you read it to me? I can't see it again.
How do you deal with the sadness of your discoveries?
You're gonna make me cry with all this makeup on? Are you kidding? I'm not sure how I deal with it. I do know that that African American women will continue to be really something. They held up their end and then some. They were trailblazers. I don't know. The only thing that helps me is to begin talking about this and to not be afraid to make a few little errors or a few little blimps, because I can go back in. But I can say that I have read over 4,000 articles that she wrote, and nobody was dealing with them. And books that she wrote, manuscripts, and going to meet family members, and family members saying, oh, I have this document here, you can have it. And, coming back home and said, oh my God, and going back through it. So yeah, there is a great degree of sadness, especially in the fact that Drusilla Dunjee-Houston was overlooked by historians, namely Black male historians, especially those men who set themselves up as the talented 10th out of Harlem. And those were men who ignored her, who relegated her to the stockpile, saying that she was a historian without portfolio. She had no high school education. She had no degrees, overlooking the fact that she was teaching school to Black children at 13 years of age when she came to Oklahoma. That saddens me, that she climbed onto a roof during a storm to hold down the roof so it wouldn't blow away. So it saddens me. But I'm so excited about being able to get some of this stuff published and, and to be able to talk about it.
All right, do we have any last questions? Going once, going twice. It's always, like I said, there's always a delay in typing. It's with this. All right. So I think we're good. Thanks so much to everybody who attended. This is very fascinating. And like I said, we'll be posting it on YouTube at a later date. It's kind of hard to tell when exactly that'll be, but I'm going to be contacting everybody who's registered. So you'll have that.
So one other thing, Matt, I want to ask, for people for something that has chat, what does that mean?
What's that?
I see a number 4 next to chat. What does that mean?
Oh, that's just the amount of chats. Like, that's the amount of times people have chatted into the chat box.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, there's just the alerts. I'm up on it. Everybody who said something is, yeah.
Yeah, no, I asked about it because I may look like I'm up on it, but trust me, I'm not.
No. We've gone over all those. So yeah. All right. Well.
Oh, I'm sorry, Matt. I want to thank my friend and colleague Barbara Nevergold for the piece that she did, the extraordinary work that she did, some of it together, but that the work that she did on the expungement of Andrew Smitherman and those 54 or 55 other Black men who history had forgotten about. She dug them up one bone at a time and saved their image forever. That was so I thank her again for doing this with me.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a good evening, and we'll be in touch later on with more webinars. And once again, thank you, Dr. Bertram. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and thank everybody for coming. You can find me on Facebook.
Great. Good night, everyone.
Good night.